Hello, and welcome to this wonderful conversation through the Australia Compassion Council, a conversation about what stops virtue, about looking at things that block us from being compassionate. My name is Gwen Pennington. I am a member of the Australia Compassion Council, and I'm joined here today with Mark Crosweller. Hi, Mark.
Good morning.
How are you?
Well.
Good, good. Before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet and pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are present today. Mark, I'm so thrilled to be joined here today with you and to connect with you on this really important topic. Your background is quite impressive. I'd love to share that with people. Mark, you have 37 years of experience in crisis, national security, and emergency management, leading major strategic reform in governance, policy, strategy, operations, and capability. Between 2012 and 2020, Mark was responsible for briefing the Prime Minister and Cabinet on disaster management and providing strategic policy advice on climate and disaster risk reduction and resilience. Mark is now the founder and director of Ethical Intelligence. He's a senior advisor to KPMG, advising on climate and disaster risk and leadership ethics. And he's also a senior lecturer at the National Security College at the Australian National University. Mark is currently finishing his PhD research on the ethical premise of leading people through the adversity and loss of disasters. Wow. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to share some of your insights and experience and research with all of us today.
You're very welcome, Gwen.
Okay. So I'd love to just start thinking about your background. You know, you've worked with numerous global leaders who spend a lot of time in the space of harm and suffering and compassion. And we know that compassion is about that desire to alleviate suffering. I'd really love to hear from you. I'm really curious about how your views about compassion and virtue have evolved over the years and maybe how they link to vulnerability as well.
Yeah, certainly. And thanks for the opportunity to chat today, Gwen. It's a real privilege to talk about such an important subject. I think over the course of my career, I literally started on the end of the fire hose when I was 20 years of age. And so I had that sort of really first-hand experience of what natural hazard impact looked like for societies and traveled a long career through emergency management and national security and crisis, and ended up, literally briefing 3 prime ministers of the Australian government over the course of 8 years. And that sort of experience from the end of the hose to the office of the prime minister, as I often describe it, was full of experiences which were about the lived experience of people. I came to profoundly understand the nature of crisis operationally, technically, scientifically, and spiritually or esoterically. And those things are really quite interdependent and interconnected, really. So we can disaggregate them and look at them from a scientific or technical perspective or operational perspective or whatever. But when it comes to the lived experience, they kind of all blend. So I realised that in essence, I saw that people were trying to do the very best they could in the very worst of circumstance to the best of their ability. And they were operating through internal and external constraints. So I take the view that people are fundamentally good but deluded. As a positionality on Buddhist philosopher and Buddhist practitioner. So I saw the best in people, and I also saw what they were struggling with. So the constraints externally were the limits of the equities of power, wealth, and resource that were available to them. So particularly as leaders in institutions, so they had resources and things in which to use to manage crisis, but sometimes they weren't enough. So there was a limitation there. But they're also battling with the internal limitations of their mind. So they were battling with self-interest, or they were battling with arrogance or ignorance or impatience. And these are universal attributes of the human mind. They're not, you couldn't say that, Bob Smith had these specific attributes and nobody else did. These are things we all deal with. And so what I was able to see was that the people were really trying to do the best they could, but there were constraints
Okay.
and limitations. And when constraint and limitation turns up, it's often the revealing of truth. It's the truth of the matter that we desire to go further, we desire to be more of, we desire to see less suffering, but we hit a constraint. And I think the big challenge for leadership is that how do you move past constraint? How do you move past limitation? Sometimes we like to think that we're limitless. So there's a limitlessness, that's a really hard word to say, in our capacity to deal with crisis and adversity. And sometimes we can get really confident about our ability to deal with crises, and we ignore limitations. So we have a wish to be a certain way. We have a wish for our organisations to be a certain way. We have can-do attitudes. We want to be identified a certain way. We want to be identified as compassionate, kind, or caring, or heroic, without necessarily understanding the limitations of all of those things. So compassion is limitless, but we hit our own personal limitations. So there's never a set of circumstances where you would say that compassion is not appropriate, for example, or kindness is not appropriate. But you can hit a set of circumstances where we run out of technique or tools or competencies in how to apply compassion in this circumstance. So they're jewels, they're perfections. And I think the big challenge is how do you move past our own personal limitations to give greater effect to those virtues that are so important to us.
Yeah. And, I love what you were saying that, we have this desire and this wish to want to do more, reduce the suffering, et cetera, but there's something that kind of might get in the way. So in your experience for leaders, whether it's leaders of organizations, of countries, of their families, or just leaders of their lives, really, what does it really take for people to translate from wish into real action and demonstrating more compassion?
I think what I found in my research was this pervasive notion and idea of being invulnerable. So closing off essentially from others, and it is absolutely pervasive in particularly in Western society, and it is a big part of our politics. And when I talk about that, I'm not talking about party politics. I'm not talking about the Australian context of Labor versus Liberal or Democrat versus Republican. I'm talking about a much more pervasive political ideology that shuts us off from relatedness. And so invulnerability sort of says that I'm not vulnerable, but you are, for example. And when I talk about vulnerability, in order to give a definition, it's the susceptibility to be harmed or to suffer. So it's a future state. So it's a susceptibility towards. And the reason I say it's a future state or an anticipatory state, Gwen, is because it means we can actually do something about it. So it's something that could happen in the future. So if we're vulnerable, we feel susceptible to be harmed. It doesn't mean we are being harmed in that moment, but there's a susceptibility, there's an exposure. When leaders close off from that, they close off from seeing the suffering of another because they close off from seeing the suffering of themselves. And so when we close off from our potentiality to experience harm and suffering, and we deny, disavow, or ignore, we're actually doing that on behalf of everybody else as well. So it tends to introduce attributes such as arrogance, totalistic intervention, ignorance. It tends to close off and separate and isolate, forces us into a more individualized state, and we just are less capable of seeing the very thing we're trying to work with, which is the suffering of other people. So when I interviewed almost 90 leaders across Australia, New Zealand and the United States at very high levels, from US presidential candidate and governor level, federal administrators, mayors, ministers, chief executives, commissioners, and then stratified down through the ranks to chief superintendents and senior managers and directors, and men and women in operational, bureaucratic and political contexts. So a really diverse array of leaders. And what I found was that by their own admission, most of them really struggled to define what loss and suffering actually looked like. But they had this, statutory obligation, constitutional obligation to protect society from harm and suffering, from loss in adversity, and a really strong intention to do that. These were good people without a doubt. You couldn't judge them in any way, shape or form as being bad. They were good, well-intentioned people. But there was an ignorance there about what loss and suffering actually meant for people. So I think they could intuit it and they could feel it, but they couldn't articulate it. And by their own admission, they would say that they need to know more about it. They did not understand it well. It sort of showed that there was a privileged positioning of leaders in institutions. We talk a lot about privilege in society at the moment. I have some really, in my mind, pretty clear views about privilege. I think that in itself, it's not a moral issue. How you get it is the moral question. Was it derived honourably, and and so on and so forth? And what do you do with it? So if you have it, how did you get it? Question. What are you doing with it? Question. I think they're questions of morality and ethics. But if you have it, you have it. It's just, I think that's just the way it is. So I looked at these leaders and based on some of them I knew, some of them I didn't, based on the interview transcripts and my sense of the person, they were honourable people, holding a space of privilege, holding the equities of power, wealth and resource in an institution. So the capacity to help people, but a blockage, didn't understand loss and suffering well, had a really high intention to be compassionate, saw it as fundamental, very important, compassion for many people, critical to leadership, but didn't understand loss and suffering. And
is that where the link to vulnerability comes in?
It does. So when I looked at what the extent to which they were prepared to be vulnerable at work, for example, then either conditionally or unconditionally, about 3/4 said they were prepared to show their vulnerability at work.
Right.
But then when I asked them, what does that look like in the work context, more than half of them said it looks like a weakness. It looks weak. And when I asked them, had they witnessed arrogance in that context, 96% of them said yes. And similar numbers when I asked about denial of vulnerability or invulnerability, almost all leaders said they'd also witnessed that. So here's a desire to reduce loss and suffering, a poor understanding of what it looks like, and a significant witnessing of arrogance, disavowal of vulnerability. And these things are competing with each other and creating an enormous blockage to what a leader is able to do with equities of power, wealth and resource. And that's really what drives politics and what drives institutions, which are there principally under constitutions of government to keep people safe. And that's part of the social contract between the citizen. So big blockage, big limitation, failing to see the suffering of a human or not. Actually, going to be straight up. So even suffering of non-humans, of landscapes, of environments, of animals, of forests, of plantations, all those sort of things. We're just not cognizant of the extent to which we can bring harm to people as well.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, that I love that you bring in not only to humans, suffering of humans, but like the systems within which we live and operate and interact with. And, you touched in the beginning about the interdependence of everything. And I really hear from a leadership perspective and even life perspective, I guess, this polarity that exists amongst, let's say arrogance and being vulnerable and, the intention that sits behind it is to do good and to support and help. And yet there's these competing priorities that come into play.
What I found was that there's this humanness, this ability, what I would say in Buddhist terms, Buddha nature, in Christian terms, agape, love of God, whatever spiritual context you want to give it, about the will to do good, the will to be good, to do good, to move towards truth, to be interconnected, interdependent, and to move the world towards greater human flourishing, wellness. And I think that's true of most people, is the direction they wish to take. And then we have institutional blockages and philosophies that underpin those blockages that say, look, we're disconnected from nature, we're independent, we're individualized, we're atomistic. We focus a lot on self-importance and self-interest, and there are ideologies and philosophies that kind of give that breadth. Do they intend to do that? I suspect not, but that's where we've ended up as a society. And all of that seeks to disconnect. So if you stop and think about it, Indigenous cultures are very big on this, and as are some of the Asian philosophies, that the connection between us and the land, the sky and the water is intimate, is complete, and their philosophies are grounded upon that interconnectedness and interbeing. Western Enlightenment philosophies completely pull us apart, elevate us as being above, separate, special, and different, and positioned really to exploit for the benefit of ourselves. And the impacts on nature, the impacts on climate are enormous. So you can see from a total systemic perspective and, you know, sort of thought perspective, a philosophical perspective, that we're wrongly positioned. I've said this for many a year in my career, you know, living with crisis, particularly in the natural world, that Mother Nature is very kind. If I was to personify that, she will tell you what she's about to do in the context of a storm, a flood, a fire, or an earthquake, or something, not so much an earthquake, but she won't ask you. So the antecedent conditions are highly overt. So she will say, I need to express, I need to exhibit force, and you need to respect and regard what I'm about to do. And of course, we ignore it at peril. So the power shifts from we're in charge, nature is there to be exploited, and then it turns on its head, and nature says, well, let me correct that for you. And now you'll have to withstand those forces of which I need to express. And we are exacerbating those forces, of course, particularly in the context of climate change, and making them worse. So we're not listening. We're not listening because we separate ourselves and see ourselves as you know, not part of, essentially. And that is so foreign to our Indigenous brothers and sisters and cultures and First Nations people. And I think to return to that sort of sense of connectedness with all that is and all that is being opens up the heart, makes us more soulful, lets the perception or the connection of suffering in, but gives us confidence that we know that we can do something about it.
Yeah, right. Okay, so for the leaders, you know, listening, if we all have the potential to reduce suffering and the potential to, I guess, foster more relatedness, as you've spoken about, in connection, or foster more disconnection and separation. So based on your research and your experience and what you've seen over the years, what do you feel is our obligation then as a leader to, as we interact with people and approach our work and our world?
I think it's to be human, to be truthful, true to self, to deeper notions of self, to what deeper notions of what we define as well-being, happiness, or flourishing. To not be one way at work and another way at home and another way in the social context, but to be human, to be in the true sense of the word, and to be wise about that. So vulnerability is tricky because it is harm and suffering. It is around the susceptibility to be harmed and the inability to. So it needs a wisdom. So would you open your heart to the world indiscriminately? I would strongly suggest not. I strongly suggest that would be very foolish to do that. So I think there's a wisdom about how a leader can be vulnerable. And I think lived experience teaches that if you use vulnerability to manipulate or to gain sympathy or to control or whatever, wrong answer. If you're using it in order to make genuine connection, correct answer. And if you're prepared to do that, then what does wisdom say about whether that environment for which you're about to expose yourself is trustworthy? And it may be quite trustworthy. You may trust those you're about to expose your true self to, or you may not quite trust it, but you can deal with the potential harmfulness. You can deal with, you know, a bit of suffering that might come your way. You say, no, I've got resilience. I have insight, I have confidence, I have lived experience, I know how to manage that harmfulness if it turns up. And it's why I think reflection and mindfulness is really important, because the lived experience, everything we've been through, and certainly my career taught me this, navigating through so much crisis personally and witnessing it professionally, that, you know, there's beauty in every experience. The worst, the ugliest, and the darkest, beauty would turn up in the middle of it, and be taken and nurtured and treasured and really put in the toolkit and taken forward for the future. And navigate harmfulness. You know, I take the view that, you know, no harm to self or other through anything that you say, think, or do. but inadvertently, because we're fallible, that we will harm people and we will be harmed. And now, not that that's acceptable, particularly if it's consciously placed upon another, but nonetheless, we do have capacity to deal with it. So we can take a risk as a leader. We can put ourselves out there. We can, to quote Brené Brown, we can be in the arena. We can be on the court. We could be losing, 6-love, 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 but we're still on the court. We're in action. We're doing the best we can. We're being as human as we possibly can be in the best of who we are, in order to reduce the harm and suffering of others. And I think that's a fundamental obligation of any leader, Gwen. It doesn't matter what the context is, what the industry is, that you have an obligation if you're going to take people in a direction that they otherwise would not go, had not thought of going, or are too fearful to go towards. That's really what leaders are trying to do. You have an obligation to protect them to the fullest extent that you can, and still achieve the objectives of the organisation.
Yeah, great. You mentioned trust and, resilience and different things, and, this obligation that we have. And I hear that talked about a lot in many organizations that I work with, across the world and across different sectors. So, and I can really hear how compassion and vulnerability would enable and support us as leaders and our obligations to be able to do that well. But my question to you is, what actually stops us as leaders from being compassionate and vulnerable? And you've spoken a bit about some of that, but I'd love to hear a little bit more on what really gets in the way and blocks it.
So I think, look, this is very Buddhist, but I think it's well, I don't think it is. I know it's true. It's really the first noble truth of Buddhist thought, and that is we should know suffering. And the basis of suffering in the mind of humanity is what's called self-cherishing or self-grasping. So, excessive self-importance and excessive self-interest. So when individuals or societies or groups in societies move towards greater interest in self and self-importance than others, or at the cost of others, at the neglect of others, we get ourselves into strife.
Yeah.
I think as a leader, how do you balance up between self and other? So I don't think it's possible at this state of human and spiritual evolution to be altruistic, certainly not in any permanent way. I think altruism exists from time to time. It exists momentarily. But really, let's face it, there's always some level of self-interest in things that we do. We seek to derive benefit. We say we don't, but we do. And I think we should admit that we're looking for some sort of satisfaction or benefit. I think that's okay, if it's done in equal measure. So if we can be generous towards others as well as generous towards ourselves and what it is that we seek in terms of interest, then we're heading in the right direction. But there's a whole range of non-virtues that kind of hold us back. And they're things like ignorance, impatience, arrogance, selfishness, pessimism, indifference, mistrust. Those sort of things sort of hold us back. And I could probably take you to a couple of slides, that we might do that actually.
Great. Yeah, great. That would be wonderful.
So just to explain what I'm about to do, in my research, I had 16 virtuous characteristics which are considered universal. So across all religions, cultures, nations. Now there's more than 16, of course, but I picked 16, which I thought most people would easily be able to identify and describe or understand. And then I looked at their antithesis, so the non-virtues. And I'll just take you to the screen and show you what I found.
That would be excellent.
Cohort of people that I interviewed. So let's have a quick look. So here we can see, here are some virtues: integrity, trust, truthfulness, justice, compassion, care, consideration, kindness. You can see them there for yourselves. These are good in their own right. So when we talk about virtue, we're talking about goods in their own right. So unlike deontological or utilitarian ethics, which seek to use reason and logic in order to argue and justify what is good, virtues are good in their own right. So compassion is good in its own right. Kindness is good in its own right. You don't need logic and reason to argue about kindness. We don't need logic and reason to argue about compassion. We do need to know how to apply it, of course, but the virtue is good in itself. And I think this was a distinction I wasn't even aware of as a leader for many years, and it was the academic research that kind of really brought this home to me, that that, you know, to be compassionate is to be good, full stop. So leaders want to be this way. They want to be identified by these things. And so here's a graph that shows how important they see these things personally, culturally, and from leadership in their organisation's perspective. And you can see that they're all pretty high. Integrity, trust, truthfulness, justice, compassion, care. You know, they sort of slide on down the scale, but they're all really important. So they're up around 90%. You know, I think the lowest is about 70% or thereabouts. So, so they're important to people. But interestingly, they're more important to people, at least in their perception, than they are to their own organisational culture or the leadership more broadly in their organisation. So this shows a couple of things. It shows that they're important. It shows a little bit of hypocrisy. And what I mean by that is that we, generally speaking, as people, will see ourselves as more virtuous than those around us. And this is well understood in the literature, that our characteristics that we want to be identified by, we tend to overstate. Now, and the differences here between the blue and then the orange and grey are generally statistically significant. So the differences are real. What I sort of say about this is, look, let's not judge that morally as being a bad or wrong thing if we're overstating, but let's accept that that's aspirational. Let's accept that that's where we want to be, and probably isn't where we're at, but it's where we want to be. So that's okay. So if these are the levels or standards in which we want to be, have integrity or be compassionate, then let's set those standards and let's move towards trying to meet them. When I then surveyed on what non-virtues look like, so what's working against them, you can see that it's almost the opposite. So we understate our non-virtue and we overstate it on behalf of others. So we look at culture, for example, particularly, we say, look, within culture, if you look at, say, blame, you know, we don't blame people, but geez, there's a lot of blame in culture.
Yeah.
We're not selfish, but there's more selfishness in culture. And, you know, I'm not fearful, but there's more fearfulness in culture. And, you know, is that true? Well, it's perceived to be by people. So I think that's important enough to say, okay, well, these things are also existing. These things are also operating. So they're kind of holding us back from being virtuous. If I just quickly go through, this is where they ended up, this particular cohort of leaders that I interviewed, and you sort of read left to right. Integrity was number one for everybody. So no matter how you cut it, personal, cultural, ranked or unranked, integrity was really important. Truthfulness, care, trust, compassion, and the compassion spread throughout there, of course, and it does rate, generally speaking, as third or fourth importance. But they're all great words. You look at what's going on in terms of cultural leadership, and personally in terms of importance, and all of those things. You would say, if you're doing those things, that's great leadership. It's really good leadership. If you're operating through those things and you're on the right path, you're doing good, you're moving towards truth, you're reducing suffering, you're helping people to be well, to flourish, and to find some sense of happiness in their own lives. So all of this is good stuff, and leaders should really focus. But here's what happens when I said to them, look, let's have a look at your top 5 personal virtues and non-virtues. You can see what's working against them.
Yeah.
I want to be a certain way, and all of this stuff in the orange is also in existence, and it's dragging them back. So what we'd really like to see is much more over here in the blue, you know, these things much more prominent, if you like. But let's have a look at this one, patience, which is really important, particularly when dealing with anger. And there's so much anger in the world at the moment, but it completely flooded by impatience, completely flooded by it. Wisdom is a really interesting one. And all the leaders I interviewed, both in my PhD and since then, wisdom rates really low and ignorance rates really high. And it suggests that we're not learning from lived experience, that we're not reflecting and saying, look, what have we learned? There's a pathway to wisdom. We have a right to wisdom as humans. We have a right to, you know, to be comfortable in our personal wisdom, in our practical wisdom. We need to align it with theoretical wisdom, of course, the wisdom of the sages, but lived experience is important, but we tend to give little credence to that. When I looked at culture, it was very much the same thing, slightly different, because, you know, lots of pessimism, lots of inconstancy, of course, you know, lots of arrogance, which I talked about earlier. And then we looked at the leadership more broadly across these organisations. Again, inconsistency or inconstancy comes up, and arrogance turns up again, impatience turns up again. So So as I said, these are all pulling us back, and
Yeah.
these are the things we don't talk about
Mm.
because we don't want to be identified by them. So they're called, they're the identities we don't want to be known by. We want
The
to be
shadow side, the dark side.
we want to be known by these things, and of course we
Yeah.
make us feel good because they are good.
Mm.
They're goods in their own right from a normative ethical perspective. But we don't want to talk about this. But unless we talk about this and say, well, these are universal attributes of the human mind as well. We all suffer from them. This is not special and different over here. This is not organisation X that's different from the rest of the world. This is humanity having to navigate this. And how do we get from this side over to this side? Well, these have to become more prominent in our minds. These have to be practiced and better understood and used and applied, and these will lessen. But if we're not cognizant of these, then they're likely to continue to pervade.
Yeah. And I can really hear the importance of vulnerability, or the, how important it is to leverage that vulnerability and make it safe to be vulnerable, so that we can really own and embrace all of these parts of us to be, like you said, fully human in our leadership, right?
You're right, absolutely right, Gwen. This is fully human. And vulnerable is to accept that, sometimes we can lack a bit of trust. We're not as trustworthy as we could be. Really hard to say. No one wants to be identified as a trustworthy person.
Yeah.
But one of the great things about humanity, we'll say great things, I'm not sure how great it is, but we have fallibility and we have hypocrisy. We have those two things that we navigate every day. And I think we should face up to our hypocrisies and our fallibilities and say, look, there's an imperfection there, and I'm prepared to work on it. As a leader, I'm prepared to do something about that. And safe environments, and leaders are obliged to provide safe circumstance. We should really be talking about these things from a personal perspective, where we're comfortable in doing that and allowing others to do the same thing. So we have an obligation to create safety, safe spaces, spiritually, emotionally, physically, hold the trust of people, be compassionate in their expression of their suffering and their fallibility and limitation, and talk through how we move from the orange to the blue. How do we become more patient? How do we tackle anger within our organisations? How do we move towards a more virtuous state of being, with commitment, with common sense, with wisdom, and with effort?
Yeah, great.
And I think that's a great conversation for leaders to have, and create the spaces for that to happen.
Yeah, fantastic. And hopefully this conversation will invite and encourage and inspire other leaders to continue this sort of conversation within their own organizations, their own communities, sectors within which they serve. It's fantastic, and I really agree with you that we have to be having these sort of conversations if we really want to be able to, as leaders and as connected individuals, teams of individuals, if we're going to be able to tackle some of the challenges, the really complex challenges we're facing today. It requires a different sort of way of being, as you talked about.
Absolutely. I think the crux of it, Gwen, is it's about relationality. Often we see leaders, and to go right back to Enlightenment philosophies about separate and disconnected and so on and so forth, that there's vulnerability is a shared space of relatedness. That there's not a human or non-human in this planetary ecosystem that is not susceptible to suffering. That's the truth. And because there's a susceptibility to suffer, there's an ethical obligation upon all of us to reduce that wherever possible. And if you're a leader that holds equities of power, wealth, and resource, and you make decisions on behalf of others who could be or are vulnerable, then you have an ethical obligation to reduce that vulnerability and that suffering wherever possible, to the extent which you are able, personally and institutionally. And that really should be shaping our public policy. These are complex matters. These are not simple. But if they're predicates of thought, if they're premises in which we establish the basis of our arguments and our policy direction, then we've got something to work with. We've got shared base. And it can still be contested. There can still be points of disagreement. There can still be agonies we can't get past. But really, they'll be small compared to what it is that we can agree upon.
Yeah, absolutely.
What a better place that would be. If you look at where we're at the moment, particularly in Australia, on some of what I call social behaviours around harassment and bullying, and it's made its way into the Parliament of Australia, and all it's
Yeah.
playing out. And you say, this is a mess. This is a real mess.
Mm.
It is about leadership and behaviour, and I don't condemn those who are in the midst of it, because in some way, shape or form it's representative of broader society, as all parliaments are. But nonetheless, it is unacceptable, and we need to navigate out of it. What's the pathway out?
Mm.
Without being righteous, nasty, angry, vitriolic, those things, we run the risk of falling into that trap
Yeah.
of being so incensed by these behaviours that we end up perpetuating the very things we want to escape from. So
Absolutely.
I should probably briefly touch on where those things can take us, which is to be shamed. And the great sadness about being shamed is that it makes us feel like we're bad. So not that we've done a bad thing, but we're bad people. We make ourselves small, and we stop talking.
Mm.
And the minute we see ourselves as bad, small, and stop talking, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
We become invulnerable. We close
Yeah.
off, shut out the world.
Yeah.
Now, shame is an important thing in the human mind, because it tells us when we've breached our moral compass.
Yeah.
So we're going to be held to account. We may feel shame, and that's okay. But when it's weaponized and thrown and targeted and used as a tool in order to try and force a direction or force a behaviour, it does the opposite. And I don't know, in my 37 years in public life, I have never seen shame succeed in good public policy, ever. Not once. I've seen entrenchment, closing off, invulnerability, denial, disavowal. I've seen all of that happen as a result of shame. I have never seen a good result. Yes, we feel it. We need to feel it, because we cut across the boundaries of our moral compass, socially and personally. So it's a good thing to have in the human mind, but it's a signpost, not a destination. We should
Absolutely.
take it as a signal to say, look, I've done the wrong thing here. I need to get better. Again, complex, but let's have a conversation with leaders about all of it. So, we've got the chance to move all of this forward in a much more beneficial direction.
Yeah, great. I love that. And I really, hear the impact of shame, for example, on both self and other, as you spoke about. I really, really appreciate everything you've shared today. We could probably sit here and talk about this for days, I would imagine. I know I could, and I'm sure you could as well. Yeah, it's a big conversation. And I guess if, my greatest wish is that more leaders, after hearing this, or even without hearing this, can continue or start having these sort of conversations. There's a couple of things that you said that really resonated with me, and I really hear them as a pathway. You talked about this pathway to being more compassionate, and you said vulnerability is a shared space of relatedness. I love that, because if we're not being vulnerable, we can't really relate. And if we're not relating, what are we doing as a leader, right? What are we creating or not creating? And then you said, to be compassionate is to be good, full stop. I really love that, keeping it really simple and clear. So I guess knowing that you mentioned wisdom as an important piece of leadership and these virtues and how we show up as a leader, do you have any parting bits of wisdom beyond what you've already shared with us today for our listeners to close and to go from here?
A couple of really key points. That understand the nature of good, and I mean good in the most profound way, not artificial, not pretense, but to move towards happiness, flourishing, and well-being is to find the goodness within the human soul or the human mind, and that your own lived experience is guiding you in that direction if you're prepared to access it. That all of the tragedies and the heartaches and the harms that we navigate as humans is all helping us to understand what it means to be human, but two, how to navigate through and find a better space. There is beauty in every experience, Gwen, and it would pay for us to look for that, even in the darkest of times, when leadership is going through so much difficulty. That there's beauty there. Look for the beauty is the virtue. It's either love or compassion or kindness. Patience, the virtues are there. The jewels are amongst the muck. You just have to sift them out and say, my goodness, look at, despite what just happened, look what's emerging, and we see this a lot. So let's understand that the lived experience is critical to the success of moving in this direction. Let's look for the beauty in every experience without ignoring the harmfulness. The harmfulness needs to be dealt with and addressed and called out for what it is. But let's not just sit in it. Let's look for the beauty and the virtue and celebrate that. Take it and move to a better world.
Yeah, great. Mark, I really hear the beauty in actually what you've shared with us today in your research and your experience, your wisdom, and your work. So thank you so much for sharing it with us, for being willing to engage in these sort of conversations with leaders and with us here today, and wish you all the best going forward.
And to you and your listeners and watchers, it's been a great privilege.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.